There is a moment in the 5th season of South Park that lasts about 40 seconds, and it changed the entire show forever. A 9-year-old boy is standing in front of a crowd at a chili cook-off in a small town in Colorado. He is smiling, not a normal smile, a smile that starts at the corners of his mouth and keeps going, widening into something that should not fit on a child's face. His name is Eric Cartman, and what he has just done, what he has just revealed to the person standing across from him, is so monstrous, so completely beyond what anyone thought a character on an animated show made of construction paper cutouts was capable of, that it fundamentally rewired the DNA of the entire series. He tricked a teenager into eating his own parents. Not metaphorically, not as a dream sequence, or an imagined scenario, or one of those what-if moments that shows use to explore dark territory without committing to it. He actually did it. He orchestrated the death of Scott Tenorman's mother and father, had their bodies ground into chili, and then fed that chili to their son while the boy's favorite band watched. And when Scott Tenorman collapsed into tears, sobbing on the ground in front of the entire town, Cartman leaned forward, collected the tears off Scott's face, and tasted them. Yes, he said. The tears of unfathomable sadness. Yummy. The show does not take this back. No character undoes it. No magical reset button is pressed. The episode ends, and the next one begins. And Eric Cartman is still Eric Cartman. Except now, everyone, the characters, the audience, the creators themselves, knows what he actually is. And what he actually is, what this show has been building and refining and examining for over 25 years, is the single most precise illustration of a philosophical warning that was written more than 100 years before the first episode ever aired. Friedrich Nietzsche spent the last productive years of his life trying to describe what would happen to human beings once the old structures of meaning collapsed. What would happen when people stopped believing in God, stopped trusting inherited morality, stopped accepting that there was a ceiling above them, telling them what was good and what was bad, and what the whole thing was for. He described several possible outcomes. He described the Übermensch, the person who would create new values from the wreckage. He described the last man, and the person who would settle into comfortable mediocrity and stop striving altogether. He described passive nihilism, the collapse inward, the drift into numbness. But there is another figure in Nietzsche's work, one that gets less attention than the others. A figure defined not by what they believe, but by what they do with power when they have it. A figure who takes the death of God, the absence of any external moral authority, and does not collapse into despair or build something new. Instead, they use the vacuum. They fill the empty space where morality used to be with their own will, their own appetites, their own ability to dominate and manipulate and consume without limit. And they do it not with the grandeur of the Übermensch, not with the creative force that Nietzsche hoped for, but with something much smaller and much more dangerous. They do it with pettiness, with cruelty, with the absolute conviction that they deserve everything and everyone else deserves nothing. Eric Cartman is that figure. He is not the Übermensch. He is not the last man. He is something worse than both of those things. He is the warning Nietzsche buried inside his most difficult texts, the outcome that Nietzsche feared more than any other, the person who inherits the freedom that comes with the death of every moral structure and uses it to eat someone else's lunch. Literally. If you're watching this late at night, get comfortable. We're going to be here for a while. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these for you. So if you're enjoying what you hear, take a second, hit the button. We'll be right here when you get back. Okay, let's talk about what Nietzsche actually meant. And then let's talk about why a construction paper 9-year-old from a small town in Colorado is the most terrifying possible answer to the question Nietzsche was asking. Most people who have heard of Nietzsche know 3 things about him. He said God is dead, he had a mustache, and he went insane at the end of his life, possibly from hugging a horse. 2 of those things are true, and one of them, the most important one, is almost always misunderstood. When Nietzsche wrote God is dead in his 1882 book, The Gay Science, he was not making a theological argument. He was not standing up in front of a lecture hall and announcing that the divine did not exist and everyone should go home and be atheists now. He was diagnosing a cultural shift that he believed was already underway and that most people had not yet noticed. For centuries, the moral architecture of Western civilization had been built on a foundation of religious authority. Not just Christianity specifically, but the broader idea that there existed somewhere above the human world a set of rules, a structure of meaning, a framework that told you what was good and what was evil, and what the point of being alive was supposed to be. You did not have to be devout to live inside this framework. You did not even have to think about it. It was simply there, like gravity, shaping the way people understood their obligations to each other, their place in the world, and the consequences of their choices. And Nietzsche saw this framework starting to dissolve. Science was providing explanations for things that religion had previously monopolized. Reason was replacing revelation. The Enlightenment had given people tools for examining the world that did not require a divine hand to operate. And as the framework dissolved, as the ceiling that had been holding everything up started to crack and buckle, Nietzsche did not celebrate. He asked the question that almost nobody else was asking. What happens to human beings when there is no longer anything above them? Here's the thing that most people miss about that question. Nietzsche was not primarily worried about whether people would become sad without God. He was not worried about whether they would feel lost or purposeless or existentially confused, although he thought those things would happen too. What terrified Nietzsche, what he spent the remainder of his productive life writing about with increasing urgency, was the question of what would happen to morality itself. Because if the moral framework that had been holding everything together was built on a foundation that was now crumbling, then the morality that people had been following was not actually grounded in anything permanent. It was not a feature of the universe. It was a construction, a human construction. And constructions can be dismantled. They can be rearranged. They can be replaced with something else entirely by anyone who has the will and the capability and the complete absence of scruple required to do so. Nietzsche laid this out in extraordinary detail in his 1887 book on the genealogy of morality. He described two basic types of moral systems. He called them master morality and slave morality. Master morality, in Nietzsche's framework, is the morality of the strong. It does not define itself in opposition to anything. It simply declares itself good. The powerful person looks at themselves and says, I am noble, I am excellent, I am worthy. And everything that is not them, everything that is weak or low or incapable, is simply bad in the sense of inferior, not evil, just lesser. Slave morality, by contrast, begins with the weak. It begins with people who cannot compete with the strong on the strong's own terms. And instead of accepting their position, they perform what Nietzsche called a transvaluation of values. They flip the entire structure. They take everything the strong person values, power, independence, self-assertion, dominance, and they relabel it as evil. And they take everything that characterizes their own condition, meekness, humility, compassion, obedience, and they relabel it as good. It is, Nietzsche argued, the most creative act of revenge in human history. The weak could not defeat the strong physically, so they defeated them morally. They built an entire ethical system designed to make strength itself seem like a sin. Now, think about Eric Cartman. I need you to hold that thought for a second, because what I'm about to describe is going to sound like I'm exaggerating, and I promise you, I am not. Cartman does not operate within either of Nietzsche's moral systems. He is not a master in the Nietzschean sense, because the master creates values out of an overflow of strength and vitality. The master says yes to life. The master affirms existence. Cartman does not affirm anything. He consumes. He is not a slave either, because the slave at least has the creative genius to build an entire moral system out of resentment, to organize the world into a structure that serves the weak by condemning the strong. Cartman has no interest in building structures. He has no interest in morality at all, not even a morality designed to serve himself. What Cartman does is something that Nietzsche described in passing, but never fully developed, because I think even Nietzsche had trouble imagining it taken to its logical extreme. Cartman inhabits the space that opens up when morality has been removed entirely. He is not beyond good and evil in the way that Nietzsche meant when he used that phrase as the title of his most famous book. Beyond good and evil, for Nietzsche, was supposed to describe the Übermensch, and the person who had moved past the simplistic categories of good and evil and created something new and genuinely valuable in their place. Cartman is not beyond good and evil. He is beneath it. He has found the empty space underneath the moral structure, and he lives there, comfortably, in the dark, doing whatever he wants. Look at what this actually looks like across the show's run. I've watched every single season putting this together, some episodes multiple times, and there is a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. Cartman does not just do bad things. Every cartoon character does bad things. Homer Simpson does bad things. Peter Griffin does bad things. Bart Simpson did bad things for 30 years. What makes Cartman different, what makes him specifically Nietzschean, is how he relates to the concept of morality while doing them. In the Season 5 episode, Scott Tenorman Must Die, which first aired on July 11th, 2001, Cartman does not simply take revenge on an older kid who tricked him. He constructs an elaborate plan that anticipates and incorporates every possible betrayal. He knows Stan and Kyle will try to warn Scott. He plans for it. He builds it into the scheme. He uses their own moral instincts, their desire to do the right thing and protect someone from harm, as a mechanism in the machine that ultimately destroys Scott Tenorman. Think about what that means philosophically. Cartman does not just lack morality. He understands morality well enough to weaponize it. He knows what good people will do because he has studied goodness the way a predator studies the behavior patterns of prey, not to participate in it, to exploit it. And he is 9 years old. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, have said in multiple interviews that this episode changed the character permanently. Parker called it the moment Cartman went from being kind of a little shithead to probably the most evil kid in the world. They debated internally whether to go through with the ending, whether having a child character orchestrate the death of someone's parents and feed them to their son in Chile was too far. And they ultimately decided to do it because they realized that the character they had been building, the selfish, manipulative, casually cruel child they had been writing for 4 seasons, was capable of exactly this. They had been assembling the components without knowing what they were building. And when they looked at the completed machine, it scared them a little. It should have. Because what they had built, whether they knew it or not, was the living embodiment of a philosophical concept that Nietzsche described as resentiment. And understanding what resentiment actually means is the key to understanding everything Cartman does for the next 20 years. Resentiment is a French word that Nietzsche used because German did not have an equivalent. It means something close to resentment in English, but deeper, more corrosive, more structural. Resentment is a feeling. Resentiment is a way of being. It is what happens when a person who feels powerless, who experiences the world as a place where they are constantly denied what they deserve, begins to organize their entire identity around that feeling of being denied. The person consumed by resentment does not simply want what others have. They want to destroy the value of what others have. They want to make the world smaller, meaner, less capable of producing the kind of joy or excellence or beauty that reminds them of their own inadequacy. And here's the part that matters most. The person consumed by resentment does not acknowledge any of this. They do not experience themselves as petty or vindictive or cruel. They experience themselves as righteous, as justified, as the only one who truly sees things clearly. Cartman experiences himself as the most important person in every room he has ever been in. He does not just believe this passively. He believes it with a ferocity that reshapes reality around him. In the season 13 episode Fish Sticks, which aired on April 8th, 2009, Cartman's classmate Jimmy Valmer writes a joke that becomes a nationwide sensation. Cartman had nothing to do with the joke. He was not present when it was written. He did not contribute a single word. And yet, over the course of the episode, through a process of memory distortion so thorough that even Cartman does not fully understand he is doing it, he convinces himself that he wrote the joke. Not that he helped write it, not that he contributed, that he wrote it alone by himself. And Jimmy was merely present. The show documents this process in extraordinary detail. It shows Cartman's memories literally changing in real time. Each time he retells the story, his own role gets larger, Jimmy's gets smaller, and the physical setting shifts to accommodate his new version of events. By the end of the episode, in Cartman's memory, Jimmy was barely in the room. This is not just comedy, although it is very funny. This is a precise illustration of what Nietzsche meant when he described how resentiment operates. The person consumed by resentiment does not steal from others openly. They rewrite the history of what belongs to whom, until taking becomes indistinguishable from having earned. They do not lie about reality in the way that a normal liar lies, knowing the truth and choosing to say something different. They reconstruct reality from the inside out so that the lie becomes, for them, indistinguishable from the truth. And then they are genuinely outraged when anyone questions it. Cartman's outrage when challenged is always genuine. That is what makes it terrifying, rather than just funny. He is not performing. He has restructured his own internal narrative so completely that any challenge to it feels to him like an attack on objective truth. I keep coming back to this point because I think it is the key to understanding everything this show is trying to do with this character. Cartman is not a villain in the traditional sense. Villains know they are doing wrong. Villains have a relationship with the moral structure they are violating, even if that relationship is one of deliberate defiance. Cartman has no such relationship. He has eaten the moral structure and is using its bones to pick his teeth. Look at what happens in the season 10 episode Tst, which originally aired on May 3rd, 2006. This is the episode where Leanne Cartman, Eric's mother, finally admits that she cannot control her son. She has tried everything. The school counselor missed her. Mackie calls her in because Cartman has put a student into a Saw-style death trap for calling him fat. Not a game, an actual trap. The student had to saw through part of his body to escape. And Leanne sits in the counselor's office and cries because she knows her son is broken and she does not know how to fix him. They bring in reality television nannies. Nanny Stella from Nanny 911 tries to set boundaries. Cartman psychologically destroys her by targeting the fact that she has no children of her own. He does not just make her feel bad. He finds the specific wound, the specific vulnerability, and he presses on it until she leaves. They bring in Super Nanny, Jo Frost, a woman who has made a career out of managing the most difficult children on television. She lasts longer than Stella, but by the end, and the show reveals her in a mental institution, eating her own excrement, rocking back and forth, saying, "It's from hell." And I need to stop here for a second, because this is one of those moments where you have to think about what the show is actually doing beneath the comedy. It is showing you a child who can break adults, not through physical strength, not through any kind of power that adults would normally recognize as threatening, but through a form of psychological manipulation so instinctive, so embedded in his basic operating system, that trained professionals who have spent their careers working with difficult children cannot withstand it. The nannies brought structure. They brought rules. They brought the entire apparatus of behavioral management that modern parenting culture has developed to address exactly this kind of child. And Cartman ate all of it. Not because he is smarter than them, although he is smarter than most people give him credit for, because he operates in a space where their tools do not work. Their tools are designed for children who exist within a moral framework. Children who have some relationship, even a dysfunctional one, with the concepts of right and wrong. Cartman has no such relationship. The tools bounce off him like ping pong balls off a brick wall. And then comes Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. And this is where the episode becomes genuinely brilliant, because Cesar does not treat Cartman like a child. He treats him like a dog. He uses animal behavior techniques, asserting dominance through body language, ignoring attention-seeking behavior, maintaining calm, assertive energy. And it works. For the first time in the entire series, Cartman's behavior actually improves. He starts doing his homework. He eats healthy food. He speaks respectfully. He becomes, for a brief window, a functioning human being. And then the episode does something devastating. Cesar Millan finishes his work. He tells Leanne she is just a client. He has other work to do. He leaves. And Leanne, who is lonely, who has no partner, who has nothing in her life besides Eric, turns to her newly reformed son and asks him to go see Madame Butterfly with her. And she says he can have anything he wants. 2 Mega Rangers. Whatever he wants. The show holds on Cartman's face as the change happens. You can see it. The little construction paper eyebrows shift. The mouth curves. The darkness flows back in like water filling a hole. And the episode ends on his smile. Ominous music playing underneath as he reverts to exactly what he was before. The fix did not hold because the fix was external. Cesar Millan could manage the behavior, but he could not touch the thing underneath it. Because the thing underneath it is not a behavioral problem. It is a structural absence. An empty space where a moral self was supposed to be, filled instead with appetite and resentiment, and the absolute certainty that the world exists to serve Eric Cartman. And anything that fails to serve Eric Cartman is the enemy. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the will to power. Most people read that phrase and think it means the desire to dominate others, the desire to accumulate authority, the desire to be in charge. That is a partial reading. For Nietzsche, the will to power was broader and stranger than that. And it was the fundamental drive of all living things, not just to survive, but to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance, and become more than they currently are. The Ubermensch channels the will to power into creation. The artist channels it into art. The philosopher channels it into thought. Even the slave channels it into the construction of an entirely new moral system. The will to power is not inherently destructive. It is simply the engine. What matters is where you point it. Cartman points it at everything, at food, at status, at the suffering of his enemies, at the obedience of his allies, at the dismantling of anything that stands between him and the momentary satisfaction of whatever he wants right now. He does not build. He does not create in any meaningful sense. He does not channel the will to power toward anything that outlasts the moment of its acquisition. He is the will to power with no direction, a motor disconnected from every wheel, spinning at maximum speed, burning fuel, generating heat, and going absolutely nowhere. And the show knows this. That is what separates South Park from any other show that has ever attempted this kind of character. The show knows exactly what Cartman is, and it has spent 25 years examining him from every possible angle without ever flinching from the examination. I want to talk about Butters, because Butters Stotch is the character who makes Cartman's nature most visible, the way you need a white wall to see the shape of a shadow. Butters is, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of Cartman. He is kind. He is trusting. He is optimistic to the point of absurdity. He believes in people even when every single piece of available evidence suggests that people, and especially the people closest to him, are not worth believing in. His parents are abusive in that specifically quiet, suburban way that the show handles with uncomfortable precision. They ground him for things that are not his fault. They punish him for being afraid. They send him to conversion therapy in the season 11 episode Cartman Sucks, because Cartman took a compromising photo of him while he was sleeping, and the parents concluded something was wrong with Butters, rather than with the child who was systematically tormenting him. Butters absorbs all of this and continues to be kind. He continues to see the best in people. He continues to show up with the same open-hearted willingness to believe that today will be better than yesterday that has characterized him since his first significant appearance in the show. And Cartman exploits this constantly, not occasionally, not when it is convenient, constantly. In the season 7 episode, Casa Bonita, which aired on November 12th, 2003, Cartman locks Butters in a bomb shelter and tells him the world has ended. He does this because Kyle is having a birthday party at Casa Bonita, a real restaurant in Colorado that Cartman loves more than anything. And Cartman was not invited because Kyle cannot stand him. The only way Cartman can get an invite is if another guest drops out. So he removes Butters from the equation, not by asking him to stay home, by convincing him that civilization has been destroyed and he is the last hope for the repopulation of the human race. And Butters believes him. He builds a little town in the bomb shelter. He makes a statue of Cartman. He waits there, alone, in the dark, for days, because Cartman told him to, and Butters trusts Cartman because Butters trusts everyone. Nietzsche would have looked at this dynamic and recognized it immediately. It is the exact relationship between what he called the noble and the herd, played out in miniature between two construction paper 9-year-olds in a fictional town in Colorado. Butters is the herd. He follows. He believes. He accepts the narrative he is given without questioning it, because questioning narratives requires a kind of suspicion that his nature simply does not contain. And Cartman is not the noble, not in any sense that Nietzsche would have admired, but he functions as the person who exploits the herd's willingness to follow. He understands something about Butters that Butters does not understand about himself. He understands that Butters' kindness is not strength, it is vulnerability. And vulnerability, in the world Cartman inhabits, is a resource to be extracted. But here is something about Butters that complicates the entire framework. And this is where I think South Park is being more philosophically sophisticated than people realize. Butters is not destroyed by Cartman. He should be. By every reasonable calculation, by every predictive model of what happens when a kind person is systematically exploited by a cruel one, Butters should be a wreck. He should be traumatized, bitter, hardened into something less vulnerable. And he is not. He keeps coming back. He keeps being kind. He keeps believing in people. Not because he is stupid, although the show sometimes plays it that way, because his kindness is structural. It is not a choice he makes in response to circumstances. It is the architecture of who he is. And Cartman cannot touch the architecture, because Cartman operates on the surface. He can manipulate Butters' behavior. He can trick him. He can hurt him. but he cannot reach the thing inside Butters that keeps generating kindness, because that thing is deeper than any of Cartman's tools can reach. This is genuinely important, because Nietzsche, for all his brilliance, sometimes wrote as though the only options available to human beings were the master and the slave, the strong and the weak, the lion and the lamb. He sometimes implied that kindness was always a form of weakness, that compassion was always a strategy of the powerless, that the person who turns the other cheek is always, at some level, performing submission rather than choosing generosity. And Butters is Trey Parker and Matt Stone's quiet rebuttal to that implication. Because Butters is kind without being weak. He is kind without being strategic. He is kind without being broken by the cruelty that surrounds him. He is, in a show full of characters who are either performing virtue or exploiting it, the one character who seems to actually possess it, not as a tool, not as a strategy, as a fact. In the season 16 episode, Butterballs, which aired on April 11th, 2012, Butters is being bullied at school. The episode deals with the culture of anti-bullying campaigns, which had become a major cultural phenomenon by 2012, and it satirizes the way that campaigns against bullying often become their own form of bullying, with celebrities and organizations exploiting the suffering of actual bullied children to generate content and attention for themselves. Stan gets involved. He makes a video. It goes viral. The whole thing spirals into a meta-commentary on the exploitation of victimhood. And Butters, at the end of the episode, delivers one of the most quietly devastating monologues in the show's history. He stands up to his bully, and he does it not by fighting, not by getting someone else to fight for him, but by saying something that the show treats as the most radical philosophical statement a character in South Park has ever made. He says that being sad is not the worst thing in the world. And he says that sadness is part of feeling things, and that he would rather feel everything, including the bad things, than feel nothing. He says that the bad feelings are the price of the good feelings, and that the price is worth paying. And I need you to hear what Butters is saying here, because what Butters is saying is Amor fati, love of fate, the acceptance of the whole of life, including the suffering, as the specific path that makes you who you are. The thing Nietzsche described as the highest possible human achievement. The thing the Übermensch was supposed to embody. The thing Rick Sanchez in Rick and Morty spends 7 seasons failing to reach. Butters achieves it, quietly, without fanfare, without philosophy, without even knowing what he is doing. He achieves it because his nature is capable of something that Cartman's nature is not. He can say yes to life, all of it, including the parts where Cartman locks him in a bomb shelter, or gets him sent to a mental institution, or convinces him the world has ended. Even those parts, because those parts are part of feeling things, and feeling things is what it means to be alive. The contrast between Cartman and Butters is not just a contrast between cruelty and kindness. It is a contrast between two fundamentally different relationships with existence. Cartman cannot say yes to life. He can only say yes to himself. The world exists for him only insofar as it serves his appetite. Other people exist for him only insofar as they can be used or consumed or dominated. His relationship with existence is extractive. He takes, he does not receive. The difference between taking and receiving is that receiving requires you to be present, to be open, to allow something outside yourself to affect you without controlling how it affects you. Cartman cannot do this. He can only take, and taking requires that you maintain control at all times, that you never allow yourself to be affected by anything you did not choose to be affected by. Butters receives. He is present in the world in a way that Cartman is structurally incapable of. He lets things in. He lets people in. He lets Cartman in over and over, knowing at some level that Cartman will hurt him, and choosing to let him in anyway, because the alternative, closing himself off, becoming hard, becoming cynical, would require him to stop feeling things. And Butters will not stop feeling things. Not because he is too stupid to know better, because he knows exactly how much it costs, and he has decided the cost is worth it. That is the Übermensch, not Cartman, not the will to power expressed as domination and appetite. Butters, the will to power expressed as the willingness to remain open in a world that punishes openness. The willingness to keep feeling in a culture that rewards numbness. The willingness to say yes to everything, including the suffering, especially the suffering, and to call the whole of it a life worth living. I genuinely did not expect this video essay to arrive at Butters being the Ubermensch, but I think the argument holds. I think Trey Parker and Matt Stone, whether they intended it or not, built the answer to Nietzsche's question into the most unlikely character in the show. Not the smart one, not the cynical one, not the brave one, the kind one. The one who gets locked in bomb shelters and sent to mental institutions and bullied by everyone around him and keeps showing up the next morning with the same open heart and the same willingness to believe that today might be different. That is what Nietzsche was looking for when he described the person who could say yes to the eternal recurrence. Not someone who was strong enough to endure the repetition. Someone who was alive enough to welcome it. Okay, I realize I have taken a significant detour through Butters' Nietzschean hero territory, and I want to bring this back to Cartman, because what I have just described about Butters throws Cartman into even sharper relief. If Butters represents the possibility of genuine moral selfhood, the proof that it is possible to develop internal architecture that cruelty cannot dismantle. And then Cartman represents the opposite. The proof that the absence of that architecture is not just a personality quirk or a character flaw. It is a catastrophe, a quiet, ongoing, completely normalized catastrophe that the culture has learned to live with by turning it into entertainment. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated, and where I think the show starts doing something that most analysis of Cartman never reaches. Because in the season 9 episode, The Death of Eric Cartman, which first aired on April 13th, 2005, something happens that the show frames as comedy, but is actually a diagnosis. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny finally reach the point where they cannot tolerate Cartman anymore. He ate all the skin off the KFC. That is the last straw. Not the cruelty, not the manipulation, not the years of abuse. The fried chicken skin. And they decide to simply ignore him, not fight him, not argue with him. Just stop acknowledging his existence entirely. And Cartman, who cannot conceive of a world in which he is not the center of attention, concludes that he has died and become a ghost. And here is where Butters comes in again. Butters was not told about the plan. So when Cartman approaches him, Butters responds normally, and Cartman concludes that Butters is a psychic who can communicate with the dead. And together, they set out to help Cartman pass on to the afterlife by making amends for all the terrible things he has done. Cartman draws up a list. It is a long list. He gives gift baskets to Scott Tenorman, to Sally Struthers, to Kyle's synagogue. He lists his crimes out loud. He says, casually, as part of a litany that he clearly views as administrative rather than emotional. There's this one kid whose parents I had killed and made into chili, which I then fed to the kid. Think about that scene. He is listing his own atrocities, and he is listing them the way you would list items on a grocery receipt. There is no weight, no guilt, no moral reckoning. The crimes are real. The list is accurate, but the person reading the list does not experience them as crimes. He experiences them as entries in a ledger that needs balancing in order to achieve a practical goal, which is getting into heaven. Not because heaven represents moral worth to him, because heaven is the next thing he wants, and not having it is annoying. And the show does something devastating at the end of the episode. Cartman's classmates show up and tell him they are willing to be his friend again, believing he is genuinely changed. And Cartman, the instant he realizes he was never dead, that the whole thing was just people ignoring him, goes berserk. He blames Butters. Butters, who spent the entire episode helping him, who submitted to being sent to a mental institution and anally probed for 14 hours because of Cartman's scheme, who showed nothing but kindness and loyalty throughout, gets the blame. And the episode ends with Butters being dragged back to the institution. The show has just shown you a character who went through every motion of moral reckoning, who said all the right words, who performed contrition with enough sincerity that even the audience briefly wondered whether something had genuinely changed. And then revealed that none of it was real. Not one moment of it. The performance of morality was indistinguishable from actual morality, except for the one detail that matters. Nothing inside Cartman changed, and nothing inside Cartman will ever change, because there is nothing inside Cartman for change to happen to. The space where the moral self is supposed to be is empty, has always been empty, and the performance of filling it is just another tool in the toolkit. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil that there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretations of phenomena. He meant that morality is not built into the fabric of the universe. It is a lens that human beings apply to events, a framework for making sense of behavior that would otherwise just be behavior. The same action, viewed through different moral lenses, who can look heroic or monstrous, depending on who is doing the looking, and what they believe about the world. What Cartman does, consistently and with increasing sophistication across the show's run, is demonstrate what happens when a person understands this Nietzschean insight, but lacks the capacity to do anything constructive with it. He does not build a new morality. He does not transcend morality. He simply notices that morality is a construction, a performance, a set of words and gestures that other people take seriously, and he learns to perform it when performing it is useful. He apologizes when apology gets him something. He cries when crying gets him something. He invokes fairness and rights and friendship and love when invoking them serves his purposes, and he discards them the instant they stop being useful. He is not beyond good and evil. He has looked at good and evil, understood that they are tools, and added them to his toolbox, alongside manipulation, cruelty, charm, and the ability to eat an entire bucket of KFC before anyone else gets home. And the show is not celebrating this. I want to be very clear about that, because one of the things that makes South Park's treatment of Cartman so much more intelligent than people give it credit for is that the show consistently, carefully, without ever breaking its commitment to being funny, shows you the consequences. Not always immediately, not always in the same episode, but across the arc of the series. The show documents with quiet precision what living inside Cartman's orbit does to the people around him. Look at Kyle. Kyle Broflovsky is in many ways the show's moral center, and the character who most consistently tries to do the right thing, who most consistently pushes back against injustice, who most consistently articulates the position that things should be better than they are. And Kyle's relationship with Cartman has been destroying him slowly for 25 years, because Kyle cannot stop engaging. He cannot walk away. Every time Cartman does something monstrous, Kyle responds, argues, fights, tries to prove that Cartman is wrong. And every single time, the engagement feeds Cartman. It does not matter whether Kyle wins the argument. What matters is that Kyle showed up, because Cartman's entire operating system runs on attention. Negative attention is fine. Positive attention is preferred, but not required. The only thing that threatens Cartman, as the death of Eric Cartman demonstrated, is no attention at all. And Kyle cannot provide no attention, because Kyle cares too much. His morality, the very thing that makes him the best person in the group, is the thing that keeps him chained to the worst. And honestly, that might be the most Nietzschean observation the show ever makes. The person who cares about right and wrong is perpetually entangled with the person who does not, because caring about right and wrong requires you to respond to its violation. And responding is exactly what the violator needs from you in order to continue. In the season 10 episode Smug Alert, which aired on March 29th, 2006, something happens that the show treats as a throwaway joke, but is actually one of the most revealing Cartman moments in the entire series. Kyle's family moves away from South Park. They leave. They go to San Francisco. And Cartman, who has spent years tormenting Kyle, who has made anti-Semitism a personality trait, who has built significant portions of his identity around the hatred and domination of this one specific person, secretly saves Kyle's life. He does not do it publicly. He does not want credit. He does it anonymously, and when it is done, he denies that it happened. The show confirms, through the structure of the episode, that Cartman needs Kyle the way an immune system needs a pathogen, without something to define himself against, without an enemy whose moral seriousness makes his own moral emptiness feel like freedom rather than vacancy. Cartman cannot function. Kyle's outrage is not an obstacle Cartman endures. It is the food Cartman eats. And when it was taken away, when Kyle left South Park and there was nobody left to be appalled by him, the Cartman went and brought him back. Not out of love, out of hunger. There is a passage in Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality where he describes the relationship between the strong and the weak, the master and the slave, in terms that are eerily applicable to Cartman and Kyle. He says that the strong do not think much about the weak. The strong person's sense of themselves is primary, spontaneous, self-generating. They look at themselves and say, I am good, and the weak are simply an afterthought, a bad, that exists mostly as contrast. But the weak, the person consumed by resentiment, cannot stop thinking about the strong. Their entire moral system is built in opposition to the person they resent. They need the object of their resentment the way a shadow needs a source of light. Without it, they have no shape. Now flip this. Because in the case of Cartman and Kyle, the roles are inverted in a way that I think Nietzsche would have found fascinating. Kyle is the moral one, the one with values, the one who represents the tradition of ethical commitment that Nietzsche associated with slave morality. And Kyle cannot stop thinking about Cartman. His moral identity depends on having something to push against. And Cartman, who should be the strong figure in this dynamic, the one who is free, the one who does not need the other, turns out to need Kyle just as badly. He needs the friction. He needs the resistance. He needs someone who takes morality seriously enough to be genuinely outraged when it is violated. Because without that genuine outrage, his violations do not mean anything. They are just things that happen. And things that just happen cannot feed a will to power that runs on domination. Cartman does not want to do evil in a vacuum. He wants to do evil in front of someone who understands that it is evil and is powerless to stop it. The witness is part of the crime. The audience is part of the performance. And Kyle, poor, righteous, incapable of walking away Kyle, is the best audience Cartman has ever had. There is a specific episode that illustrates this dynamic so perfectly that I have rewatched it 4 times putting this together. It is the season 5 episode, It Hits the Fan, which aired on June 20th, 2001. I know, that episode is primarily about the word shit being said on television uncensored for the first time. That is the A-plot. But watch what Cartman does in that episode. Watch how he navigates the sudden collapse of a cultural boundary, the removal of a restriction that had been in place since the beginning of broadcast television. The word shit is suddenly allowed. Everyone says it. The novelty wears off. The characters adjust. And Cartman adjusts fastest. Because Cartman does not experience the removal of a restriction as liberation, the way a philosopher might. He experiences it as opportunity. One fewer boundary means one more space to operate in. The removal of a cultural norm is, for Cartman, identical to the removal of a wall in a building he is robbing. More access, more room to move, more angles of attack. This is what the show has been documenting across every season with meticulous consistency. Every time a cultural norm weakens, every time a social boundary softens, every time a restriction is removed or relaxed or simply stops being enforced, Cartman is the first person through the gap. Not because he fought for the gap to exist, not because he has a philosophical position on the gap, because the gap is there and he is hungry, and gaps are how hungry things move through walls. And this is where I want to draw a line that I think most analysis of Cartman misses entirely. Most people who write about Cartman compare him to real-world demagogues, to manipulative politicians, to corporate sociopaths. And those comparisons are not wrong, but they are not specific enough. Because what makes Cartman uniquely terrifying, what makes him the character Nietzsche was warning about, rather than just another fictional villain, is not that he manipulates people, or that he is cruel, or that he lacks empathy. It is that he is a child. He is a child. He is 8 years old, 9, depending on the season. He has not had time to develop the sophisticated rationalization systems that adult manipulators develop. He has not had time to build a worldview that justifies his behavior to himself. He does not need one. The behavior comes first. The rationalization, if it comes at all, is retroactive and immediate and forgotten within seconds. He does not plan his manipulation the way an adult sociopath plans theirs, with long-term strategy and careful assessment of risk and reward. He manipulates instinctively, the way a stomach digests food. The process is not conscious. It is not deliberate in the way that deliberation implies forethought and evaluation. And it is simply what happens when a person without internal moral structure encounters a world that does not impose external moral structure with enough force to compensate. And I think this is the detail that makes Cartman the most important character in the history of American satire. Not because he is the funniest, although he is often extraordinarily funny. Not because he is the most shocking, although he has done things that no other character on television has done. Because he is the most honest depiction of what happens when a human being develops without moral architecture. Not a human being who had moral architecture and rejected it. Not a human being who understands right and wrong and chooses wrong. A human being for whom the categories of right and wrong simply do not exist as internal experiences. And they exist as words that other people use. They exist as social conventions that can be navigated. They exist as tools that can be deployed. But they do not exist as felt realities. They do not generate the internal friction that moral feelings are supposed to generate. The signal that says, "this is wrong," does not fire. Not because it was turned off, because it was never installed. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the bad conscience, the internal mechanism by which human beings monitor their own behavior against a standard of what is right. He traced the development of the bad conscience to the moment when human beings first began living in social groups and had to suppress their natural instincts, their aggression, their appetite, their desire to dominate, in order to coexist with others. The bad conscience, in Nietzsche's account, is not a natural feature of human beings. It is a social construction, developed over millennia of communal living, internalized through generations of moral education, maintained through the ongoing pressure of social norms and expectations. It is, in other words, the ceiling, the thing above you that tells you where you cannot go. Cartman does not have a bad conscience. He has never developed one, and the show's 25-year examination of what a person without a bad conscience looks like, sounds like, acts like, and does to the people around them is the most thorough exploration of Nietzschean philosophy that popular culture has ever produced. Not because it intended to be, because the truth it is telling happens to be the truth Nietzsche was trying to tell. The ceiling is not natural, it is constructed. And when the construction fails, what moves through the space where the ceiling was supposed to be is not the Übermensch. It is appetite. Raw, undirected, insatiable appetite. A child standing at a buffet table, piling food onto a plate that is already overflowing, unable to stop because stopping would require a mechanism for satisfaction that was never built. Let me talk about one more Cartman scheme before we bring this together, because I think it demonstrates everything I have been trying to say more clearly than any philosophical argument could. In the Season 8 episode, Awesome O, which aired on April 14th, 2004, Cartman disguises himself as a robot and infiltrates Butters' home. He does this because he believes Butters has a video of Cartman doing something embarrassing, and he wants to find and destroy the tape before Butters can use it against him. So Cartman builds a cardboard robot costume, calls himself Awesome O 4000, and shows up at Butters' house pretending to be a gift. Butters believes it immediately. He does not question why a robot was delivered to his house. He does not find it suspicious that the robot sounds exactly like Eric Cartman. He simply accepts it because Butters accepts things, and he begins treating Awesome O as his companion. And here is where the episode becomes something more than a sitcom premise. Because Butters trusts Awesome O completely. He tells the robot his secrets. He shares his feelings. He talks about his fears and his hopes, and the things he is too embarrassed to tell anyone else. And he treats Awesome O with the kind of openness that he cannot sustain with actual human beings, because actual human beings have given him reasons to be guarded. The robot, paradoxically, is the first safe relationship Butters has ever had, because a robot cannot judge you. A robot cannot betray your trust. A robot cannot use your vulnerabilities against you, except this robot can, because this robot is Cartman. And Cartman sits inside the cardboard box, listening to everything Butters says, cataloging every weakness, every vulnerability, every piece of ammunition, fully intending to use it all against him the moment the disguise comes off. And the show lets this play out for the entire episode. It lets you watch Cartman sitting inside a box, sweating, uncomfortable, slowly running out of patience, hearing things about Butters that he never wanted to hear, developing against his will something that almost resembles guilt, and then, not quite, not guilt, something adjacent to guilt, something that flickers at the edges of Cartman's consciousness and then disappears before it can take shape, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you cannot quite remember because you never learned it in the first place. The episode ends with Cartman's identity being revealed. Butters is briefly upset, and then the video that Cartman was afraid of, the embarrassing tape, turns out to exist after all. And Butters, sweet innocent Butters, shows it to the entire class. And it is genuinely embarrassing for Cartman. And for one moment, one brief flash, the power dynamic inverts. The exploiter is exposed. The manipulator is humiliated. Then the robot is revealed as a sweating, cramped, uncomfortable child in a cardboard box. Trey Parker has said that episodes about the Cartman-Butters dynamic are some of his favorites to write, and I think I understand why. Because the Cartman-Butters dynamic is the show's entire philosophy compressed into two characters. It is the question of whether cruelty or kindness is more durable, whether manipulation or trust is more resilient, whether the person who uses people or the person who loves them ends up ahead. And the show's answer, delivered over 25 years of episodes, is genuinely ambiguous. Sometimes Cartman wins, sometimes Butters wins, sometimes nobody wins, and the episode just ends with both of them exactly where they started. The show refuses to resolve the question, because resolving it would be dishonest. And the question of whether cruelty or kindness prevails is not a question that has an answer. It is a question that has a process, and the process is called life, and it is ongoing, and it does not conclude. If you've made it this far, you already know this is not just a video about a cartoon show. And honestly, I think that is the point. South Park has been doing something for over 25 years that almost nobody gives it credit for, which is using the crudest possible visual language. Construction paper cutouts, fart jokes, 8-year-olds swearing, to deliver some of the most precise philosophical observations in the history of American television. And nowhere is that precision sharper than in what the show does with Eric Cartman. I want to talk now about the thing that most people do not talk about when they talk about Cartman. Not the cruelty, not the manipulation, not the escalating pattern of behavior that started with telling Kyle's mom she was a fat bitch and ended with feeding people to their relatives. I want to talk about Cartman's mother. Leanne Cartman is the single most important character in the show's examination of how someone like Cartman comes into existence. And the show handles her with a care and a sadness that almost nobody notices, because Leanne is usually being used as a punchline. The running joke across the first several seasons is that Leanne is promiscuous. Wildly, absurdly, comprehensively promiscuous. She has had sexual relationships with most of the adults in South Park, and a significant number of people outside it. This is played for laughs. It is meant to be funny, and it is funny in the way that South Park is always funny, which is to say, it is funny until you think about it for more than 10 seconds, and then it becomes something else entirely. Because what the show is also telling you, underneath the jokes, is that Leanne Cartman is a woman who has never had a stable partner, who raised her son entirely alone, who has compensated for the absence of any meaningful adult relationship in her life by giving Eric everything he wants. Not some of what he wants, everything. She does not discipline him. She does not set boundaries. She does not say no. When Cesar Millan's techniques begin to work, when Eric starts becoming a functioning human being, the first thing Leanne does when Cesar leaves is undo all of it, because a reformed Eric is an Eric who does not need her the way the unreformed Eric does. She would rather have a monster who depends on her than a healthy child who does not. And the show, to its enormous credit, does not present this as villainy on Leanne's part. It presents it as damage. Leanne is a damaged person raising a child alone in a town that offers her nothing in the way of support or companionship. And she has filled the emptiness in her life with the only relationship she has, which is her relationship with her son. And she has filled it by making sure that her son cannot function without her, which means she has to keep him broken. Nietzsche wrote about the origins of moral systems and argued that they are always, at root, about power relationships. The morality a society teaches its children is never neutral. It is always shaped by the needs of the people doing the teaching. Leanne's moral education of Eric is the most extreme possible version of this. She has not taught him that the world owes him everything, because she believes it philosophically. She has taught him this because a child who believes the world owes him everything will always come back to the person who gives him everything. She has not taught him that other people's feelings do not matter, because she is a nihilist. She has taught him this because a child who respects other people's feelings might form bonds with those other people and not need his mother quite as much. She has created, without intention, but with devastating effectiveness, a person who can function in the world only through the exercise of will upon others, because that is the only model of human relationship she ever provided him. Cartman does not love his mother. He uses her, and she allows it, because being used is the closest thing to being needed that she has ever known. This is the part of the Cartman story that I think about at 3 in the morning when I cannot sleep. Because the show is telling you, if you are paying attention, that Cartman is not a monster who appeared from nowhere. He was made. He was assembled, piece by piece, by a combination of absent parenting, unmet needs, and a social environment that never once successfully intervened in the process. The town of South Park watched Eric Cartman become what he is. Mr. Mackey called meetings. Mr. Garrison taught his classes. Chef offered advice. Stan and Kyle pushed back, and none of it worked. None of it was enough, because fixing Cartman would require doing something that no one in the show And arguably, no one in the kind of culture the show is satirizing is equipped to do. It would require addressing the conditions that produced him, not just the behavior. The conditions. The mother who cannot set boundaries. The absent father. The community that treats cruelty as entertainment until it becomes genuinely dangerous and then throws up its hands and calls someone on television to fix it. The entire structure of a society that produces people like Cartman and then acts surprised when they do what people like Cartman do. And this is where I want to take a detour, because there is a version of the Cartman story that the show tells through someone else entirely, through Stan. Stan Marsh is the character who is supposed to be normal. That is literally how the show's website describes him. A normal, average, American, mixed-up kid. He is Trey Parker's avatar, loosely based on Parker himself. And for the first several seasons of the show, he functions as the audience's point of entry into the world of South Park. He has the reactions that a reasonable person would have. He is disgusted when disgusting things happen. He pushes back against injustice, although less aggressively than Kyle. He tries, in his quiet, overwhelmed way, to make sense of a world that makes no sense. And his relationship with Cartman is defined by something that I think is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in the entire show. Stan is tired of Cartman. Not angry, not morally outraged, tired. He has seen what Cartman does. He knows what Cartman is, and he has reached the point where the energy required to fight it simply does not feel worth it anymore. He goes along. He objects occasionally, but without conviction. He watches the schemes unfold and makes the calculation, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, that the effort of stopping Cartman exceeds the damage Cartman will do this time. And then Cartman does something worse than Stan calculated, and Stan is surprised. And then the next time, he makes the same calculation again. This is the dynamic of institutional failure played out in a friendship between two 9-year-olds. The institution in this case is the friendship group itself, the social structure that is supposed to regulate behavior through norms and expectations, and the implicit threat of exclusion. And the institution fails over and over because Cartman is willing to expend more energy being terrible than Stan is willing to expend preventing it. The asymmetry of motivation is the whole game. Cartman cares about winning more than Stan cares about stopping him. And that gap, that energy differential, is where Cartman lives. Not in the spaces between good and evil. In the spaces between caring and not caring quite enough. In the season 15 episode, Human Centipede, which aired on April 27th, 2011, this dynamic reaches a point that is almost unbearable to watch. Cartman becomes convinced that his mother owes him an iPad, not because she promised him one, not because he earned one, because he wants one, and she has not provided it. And in Cartman's moral universe, the failure to satisfy his desires is a form of abuse. He screams at her. He berates her in public. And he tells strangers that his mother fucked him, deliberately using language that implies sexual abuse to generate sympathy, when what actually happened is that she bought him the wrong electronic device. The show holds on this. It lets Cartman's tantrum play out in real time, in a mall, in front of other people, with Leanne crying and Cartman screaming, and the onlookers shifting uncomfortably. It is one of the few Cartman scenes that is not primarily funny. It is primarily uncomfortable, in the specific way that watching a genuine public meltdown is uncomfortable. Not because anything dramatic is happening, but because the normal social contract has broken down and nobody knows how to respond. And the thing that kills me about this scene, the thing I keep thinking about, is that nobody intervenes. The people in the mall watch. And Leanne cries, Cartman screams, and the scene ends with Cartman getting what he wants, because Leanne cannot survive the confrontation long enough to outlast his willingness to make it worse. The will to power, in its most debased form, is simply the willingness to be more uncomfortable than the person you are trying to dominate, to make the situation so unpleasant, so publicly embarrassing, so emotionally exhausting, that the other person gives in just to make it stop. Cartman does not overpower his mother. He outwears her. He has more stamina for awfulness than she has for resistance. And that is enough. In a world without a ceiling, that is always enough. Now I want to go somewhere darker. I want to talk about what Cartman does with religion. South Park has always had a complicated, often brilliant relationship with religious satire. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have gone after Christianity, Mormonism, Scientology, Islam, Judaism, and pretty much every organized religion that has ever existed. sometimes in a single episode. Their approach is consistent. They do not hate religion. They distrust the structures that religion builds around belief, the institutions, the hierarchies, the mechanisms of control. But they also recognize, more honestly than most satirists, that the beliefs themselves are often held by people who are genuinely trying to make sense of the world. The Mormon episode, All About Mormons, from Season 7, which aired on November 19, 2003, spends 20 minutes mocking the historical absurdities of the Mormon faith, and then ends with the Mormon kid, Gary, standing up for his beliefs despite the mockery. And it is the show being honest about the function of religious belief in a way that most atheist comedy refuses to be. It is saying that the content of belief might be absurd, but the structure it provides, the community it builds, the moral framework it offers, has genuine value for the people who live inside it. It is Nietzsche's observation about the death of God taken seriously rather than triumphantly. The building that God held up might have been built on a fiction, but the people inside the building were warm, and now the building is falling down. And then there is Cartman's relationship with religion, which is, predictably, the most cynical thing the show has ever produced. Cartman uses religion the way he uses everything else, as a tool. He starts churches, not because he has found God, but because he wants money from the congregation. He does not believe in God. He does not disbelieve in God. The question of God's existence is simply not relevant to his calculations. What is relevant is that other people believe, and their belief can be converted into resources. This is a transvaluation of values that Nietzsche described, played out at the level of a child's hustle. Nietzsche said that the weak performed a moral revolution by taking the values of the strong and inverting them, turning power into sin and submission into virtue. Cartman performs a different kind of transvaluation. He does not invert values. He hollows them out. He takes the external form of value, the words, the gestures, the rituals, and he removes the internal content. He keeps the shell and discards the substance. And then he uses the shell as a container for whatever he actually wants, which is always the same thing. More food, more power, more attention, more control. And people fall for it. That is the part that makes the show's satire bite so hard. People in South Park fall for Cartman's religious hustle the same way they fall for his other hustles. Not because they are stupid, because the shell looks right. The words sound right. The performance hits the expected notes. And in a world where the substance has already been hollowed out of most institutions, a 9-year-old running a church scam is just one more hollowed out institution in a landscape full of them. And you know what? I want to sit with this for a second, because it connects to something the show does in the Season 9 episode Ginger Kids, which aired on November 9th, 2005. Cartman gives a school presentation about how ginger-haired children, kids with red hair, freckles, and pale skin, are subhuman. He presents this with visual aids. He delivers it with complete conviction. He frames it as educational content, and the other children start believing him. Not because they are stupid, not because they secretly hate redheads, but because the presentation hits the right notes. It looks like real information. It sounds like something an authority figure would say. And in a world where information increasingly comes from people who perform authority rather than possess it, the performance is all you need. The boys decide to teach Cartman a lesson, and they sneak into his room while he is sleeping and apply makeup to make him look like a ginger kid. He wakes up, sees his reflection, and instead of realizing it is a prank, instantly switches sides. He does not just accept being ginger. He immediately becomes the most aggressive ginger rights activist in South Park. He organizes rallies. He gives speeches. He leads the ginger kids in what amounts to a supremacist movement, declaring that ginger children are the master race and all non-ginger children should be sent to death camps. I need you to think about what just happened there. In the span of one episode, Cartman goes from leading a hate movement against gingers to leading a supremacist movement for gingers. The target changes. The mechanism is identical. The certainty is identical. Then the willingness to organize other people around his conviction is identical. The only thing that changed is which side of the line he believes he is standing on. This is not satire of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy requires a person to hold one set of values publicly while privately holding another. Cartman does not hold any values. He holds positions. And positions, unlike values, can be swapped out instantly when circumstances change, because positions are not connected to anything internal. They are not rooted in experience or reflection or conscience. They are tactical. They are responses to the question, what benefits me right now? And the answer to that question changes with the wind. Nietzsche wrote about the difference between a person who has values and a person who uses values. Then the person who has values experiences them as part of their identity, as something they would not abandon even at great personal cost, because abandoning them would feel like losing a piece of themselves. The person who uses values experiences them as tools, as instruments that serve particular purposes in particular situations, to be picked up when useful and discarded when not. The person who has values might be wrong about many things, but they are at least real. The person who uses values might appear right about everything, but they are not real in any sense that matters. They are a performance of a person, animated by appetite, directed by circumstance, and wearing whatever ideological costume happens to serve the moment. That is Cartman in Ginger Kids. That is Cartman in every episode. A costume change without a body underneath. And this connects to something else the show does brilliantly in the season 11 episode Le Petit Tourette, which aired on October 3rd, 2007. Cartman encounters a boy with Tourette's syndrome and immediately recognizes an opportunity. If he pretends to have Tourette's, he can say anything he wants, any slur, any insult, any terrible thing that enters his head, and nobody can punish him for it because it will be attributed to his condition. He fakes the symptoms. He gets an official diagnosis, and he begins his rampage. But then something happens that the show treats as one of its most precise psychological observations. After spending days saying whatever comes into his head without any filter, the filter itself begins to break down. And the things that start coming out of Cartman's mouth are no longer tactical slurs and calculated insults. They are genuine secrets. Real things about himself that he would never voluntarily reveal. Embarrassing things. Vulnerable things. Things that the filter was not just keeping in for strategic reasons, but for personal ones. The performance of total honesty, which Cartman intended as a weapon, becomes actual honesty, which Cartman experiences as a disaster. The show is making an extraordinary observation here. It is saying that the mechanism Cartman uses to suppress his inner life, the filter that keeps the real Eric Cartman locked away behind the performing Eric Cartman, is the same mechanism he would need to deploy the Tourette's scam. You cannot selectively remove your filter. You cannot say, I will have no filter for the things I want to say, and maximum filter for the things I do not want to say. The filter is one system. Remove it, and everything comes out. The tactical garbage and the genuine secrets. The weapons and the wounds. And for one episode, for about 22 minutes, you get to see what is behind the wall. Not much. A few embarrassing confessions. A few moments of genuine vulnerability. Nothing that fundamentally changes who Cartman is, but enough to confirm that there is something behind the wall. Something small and human and terrified of being seen. Something that the entire apparatus of Cartman's personality, the schemes and the cruelty and the appetite and the will to power, exists to protect. That small, terrified thing is the closest the show ever gets to showing you a real Eric Cartman. And it is there for about 12 seconds before the filter snaps back into place and the performance resumes and the show moves on and Cartman is Cartman again and the audience laughs and nobody talks about what they just saw. I want to talk about the Coon now. I have been putting this off because it is complicated and because it involves Cartman doing something that, in a lesser show, would be played as a heroic arc. But this is not a lesser show. In the season 13 episode, The Coon, which aired on March 18th, 2009, Cartman creates a vigilante alter ego called the Coon, a raccoon-themed superhero who patrols the streets of South Park fighting crime. Or rather, who performs the image of fighting crime while actually doing nothing useful. The Coon is Cartman's will to power in costume form. It is his desire to be seen as extraordinary, to be recognized, to be at the center of events, wrapped in a mask and a cape. He does not want to help people. He wants to be the kind of person who is seen as helping people. The distinction is everything. When Mysterion, another masked hero, begins actually helping people, actually stopping crimes, actually earning the respect that Cartman believes belongs to him by right, Cartman's response is not to become a better hero. It is to destroy Mysterion. He teams up with Cthulhu, the actual Cthulhu from the Lovecraftian mythos. And Cartman's reaction to meeting an elder god of incomprehensible cosmic horror is to climb on its back and use it to destroy his enemies. He directs Cthulhu to wipe out synagogues, to obliterate San Francisco, to eliminate anyone and anything that has ever annoyed him. He takes a being that represents cosmic nihilism, the complete absence of meaning in the universe, and he turns it into a pet. I have a theory about this that I have never seen anyone else bring up. I think the Coon storyline is the show's direct answer to the question of what happens when you give a Cartman real power, not just the petty social power he wields over Butters, not just the manipulative intelligence he uses against Kyle, actual cosmic level power, the ability to reshape reality according to his will. And the answer is that it changes nothing. He does exactly what he has always done. He uses it to settle scores, to inflate his own importance, to consume and dominate and discard. The scale changes. The nature does not. A Cartman with the power of Cthulhu is the same Cartman who ate the skin off the chicken. He is just doing it on a bigger plate. Nietzsche described the will to power as something that, in its highest form, would create new values, new forms of beauty, new ways of being human that had never existed before. He believed that the extraordinary individual, freed from the constraints of herd morality, would use that freedom to build something that justified the entire human project, the dancing star. And he believed this so deeply, wanted it so desperately, that he sometimes glossed over the other possibility, the possibility that the individual freed from all constraints would not build a dancing star, would not build anything at all, would simply take the freedom and use it to eat. I think Trey Parker and Matt Stone understand this possibility better than almost anyone who has ever adapted Nietzschean ideas into narrative form. And they understand it because they are not trying to make a point about philosophy. They are trying to make a point about people. And the point about people, the point that Cartman embodies more completely than any argument they could ever make, is that freedom without values does not produce creation. It produces consumption. It produces appetite wearing the mask of ambition. It produces a 9-year-old riding Cthulhu like a pony while synagogues burn in the background. If you're still with me at this point, thank you. We have been going a while, and I know this is heavy territory for a show about construction paper kids from Colorado, but that is exactly the point, right? That is what South Park has always done. Hidden the heaviest possible observations inside the lightest possible container, and trusted the audience to feel the weight. Let me talk about something that ties all of this together: the future. In 2021, South Park released 2 special films on Paramount Plus called South Park Post-COVID and South Park Post-COVID, The Return of COVID. These specials jump forward in time and show the main characters as adults, living in a world that has been shaped by decades of the same dynamics the show has been exploring since 1997. And the version of Cartman they show is the most provocative thing the show has ever done with the character. He is a rabbi. He has a Jewish wife named Yentl and 3 children. He lives in a modest home. He is kind, patient, devout. He quotes Torah. He cooks Shabbat dinner. He wears a yarmulke that looks like his childhood hat with the yellow puffball on top. And Kyle cannot stand it. Kyle looks at this reformed Cartman and sees the longest con in human history. He sees decades of anti-Semitism suddenly reversed, and he does not believe for a second that it is genuine. He thinks Cartman converted to Judaism specifically to torture him, specifically to take the one thing Kyle has always had, his faith, his identity, his moral foundation, and use it as yet another weapon in their endless war. And here's the thing: the show does not tell you whether Kyle is right. It gives you evidence for both interpretations. When the timeline resets and the future changes, Cartman ends up homeless rather than a rabbi. His wife and children disappear, and Cartman, briefly, seems to feel genuine loss. It lasts about 3 seconds, and then he moves on. And the audience is left with the same question the show has been asking for 25 years. Is there a real person in there? Has there ever been? And does it matter? I think the show's answer, the answer it has been building towards across its entire run, is that the question itself is the wrong question. Because asking whether Cartman is really good or really evil implies that there is a stable self underneath the performances. A genuine Eric Cartman who can be found if you dig deep enough. And the show's argument, the argument Nietzsche would have recognized immediately, is that there might not be a self underneath. There might only be performances all the way down. Masks on top of masks on top of masks. And when you remove the last mask, there is not a face. There is just the space where a face was supposed to be. Nietzsche warned that the death of God would leave a vacuum. He warned that the vacuum would be filled. What he did not fully describe was the possibility that some people would become the vacuum, that the empty space where values used to be would not just be external, a feature of the culture, but internal, a feature of the individual. That there would be people who had never developed the internal architecture that moral structure requires. Not because they chose not to, because nothing in their environment built it for them. And you cannot choose to build something when the tools have never been offered, and the blueprints have never been shown, and the building itself has never been described in terms you could understand. Cartman was never offered the tools. Leanne gave him everything except the one thing he needed, which was a reason to believe that other people's experiences are as real as his own. The town never enforced consequences with enough consistency to teach him that actions have weight. The school system, represented by the endlessly inadequate Mr. Mackey and the variably insane Mr. Garrison, never provided a moral education that could compete with the moral vacuum of his home. And his friends, the 3 boys who stood at the bus stop with him every morning and tolerated him every afternoon, never found a way to make the cost of being his friend high enough to force a genuine change. The show is not blaming these people. It is showing you a system of small failures, each one individually understandable, each one individually forgivable, that collectively produce a person without a moral center. And it is showing you this system with the same cold precision that Nietzsche used when he described the slow erosion of the structures that held Western civilization together. Not a dramatic collapse, not an explosion, a slow, quiet, completely understandable process of things falling apart, one small failure at a time, until the building is standing in name only, and the people inside it have forgotten there was ever supposed to be a ceiling. I want to talk about one more thing before we bring this home. I want to talk about Cartman and Kenny, because this is the relationship that the show treats most casually, and that I think reveals something the other relationships do not. Kenny McCormick dies, all the time. In virtually every episode of the first 5 seasons, Kenny is killed in some inventively horrible way, and then returns in the next episode without explanation. The show treats his deaths as a running gag. The other characters barely react. Stan says, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle says, "You bastards." And then they move on. Nobody grieves. Nobody processes it. Nobody asks what it means that their friend keeps dying and coming back. And nobody acknowledges the dying or the coming back. It is presented as comedy. It is the show's most recognizable running bit. And Cartman's relationship with Kenny's death is the most telling version of this. Because Cartman does not just not grieve. Cartman benefits. In the season 5 episode, Kenny Dies, which aired on December 5th, 2001, Kenny is actually dying for real. Not the usual gag death, but a genuine terminal illness. He is in the hospital, and he is suffering, and Cartman visits him. Cartman sits by his bedside and talks to him, and appears, for the first and possibly only time in the entire series, to feel something genuinely. He seems to care. The audience is moved. Is this the moment? Has Cartman finally connected with another human being suffering in a way that is not performative? No. The entire visit, the entire performance of grief, turns out to be a cover for Cartman's real plan, which involves using stem cells from aborted fetuses to create his own Shakey's Pizza franchise. Kenny's illness is not the point. It was never the point. It was the emotional background noise that Cartman needed to justify his presence in a hospital where he could access the resources he actually wanted. He used Kenny's dying to get what he needed. And the performance of caring was so convincing that even the audience, who should know better by now, was fooled. This is the will to power at its most complete. Not power over other people's bodies. Power over other people's feelings. Power over the very mechanism by which human beings connect with each other. The shared experience of grief. The recognition of suffering. The instinct to be present for someone who is in pain. Cartman has learned to simulate all of these things perfectly. His simulations are indistinguishable from the real thing. And the fact that there is nothing behind the simulation, that the grief is not real, that the caring is not real, that the connection is not real, does not matter. Because in a world where the substance of moral life has been replaced by its performance, the performance is the substance. That the show is saying something here that I think goes beyond Cartman, beyond South Park, beyond even Nietzsche. It is saying that in a culture that has lost the ability to distinguish between genuine moral feeling and its performance, the performer has unlimited power, because the only thing that can expose the performance is a standard of authenticity that the culture no longer possesses. And that, right there, is the warning. Not that someone like Cartman will exist. Of course, someone like Cartman will exist. People like Cartman have always existed. The warning is that the culture that surrounds him will lose the ability to see what he is, will lose the tools for recognizing the difference between caring and performing caring, between morality and its simulation, between a person and a mask. Will lose these tools so gradually and so completely that by the time someone stands up and says, "This is not a person, this is a performance," the response will be, "What's the difference?" Nietzsche saw this coming. He saw the dissolution of the structures that allowed human beings to tell the difference between the genuine and the performed. He saw the approaching era in which the performance of values would replace the holding of values. And he wrote about it with the urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time. And this is where Nietzsche's warning becomes something more than an interesting philosophical parallel. This is where it becomes an actual prediction. Nietzsche said that when the old moral structures collapse, the space they leave behind will not remain empty. Something will fill it. And the thing that fills it will be determined not by what is good or true or valuable, but by what is powerful enough to take the space. The vacuum does not select for quality. It selects for will. And the person with the most will, the person who wants the most, the person who is least encumbered by scruples or compassion or self-doubt, that person moves into the empty space first. They do not build a cathedral in the space where God used to be. They build a drive-through. They build whatever serves them in the moment. And they call it civilization. And they dare anyone to tell them it is not. And this is where I want to bring in something that I have been thinking about throughout the entire process of making this video. The audience. You. Me. And the people who have watched South Park for 25 years and laughed at Cartman and quoted Cartman and worn Cartman on their t-shirts and put Cartman in their profile pictures and somehow, despite everything the show has been telling them, come away from the experience thinking that Cartman is cool. Because some people do think Cartman is cool. Not cool in the way that a well-written villain is cool. Cool in the way that a role model is cool. They see his certainty and they admire it. They see his willingness to say things that other people would never say, and they call it honesty. They see his refusal to submit to social pressure, and they call it strength. They see his ability to get what he wants, regardless of the cost to others, and they call it intelligence. And they look at Eric Cartman, and they see a person who has figured out the game, who is operating at a higher level than the suckers around him, who is winning, and they are wrong. They are catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. And the show has been telling them they are wrong since the very first episode, but they cannot hear it because the warning is wrapped in the thing they are enjoying. The comedy is the disguise. The entertainment is the camouflage, and the person who has been trained to consume entertainment without examining it, the person Nietzsche would have called the last man, the person who blinks and discovers happiness and moves on to the next piece of content, that person will never hear the warning, because hearing it would require them to stop laughing long enough to listen. And this is the same dynamic that happens across all of adult animation, when a show creates a character who embodies a philosophical warning, and the audience absorbs the character as an icon. The fans who idolized Rick Sanchez, without hearing that his catchphrase meant, "I am in great pain, please help me." The people who treated the nihilism as a lifestyle brand, without noticing that the show was spending every season demonstrating that nihilism was destroying the nihilist. South Park has its own version of this phenomenon, and it is arguably more insidious because Cartman is not performing pain. He is not hiding a confession inside a catchphrase. He is performing emptiness. And emptiness, unlike pain, does not generate sympathy. It generates admiration in people who mistake emptiness for freedom. The person who does not care about anything looks free. They look unburdened. They look like they have solved the fundamental problem of being alive, which is that caring about things makes you vulnerable to losing them. And in a culture that is terrified of vulnerability, a culture that treats emotional exposure as weakness and detachment as strength, the person who genuinely does not care about anything becomes the aspirational figure, the person everyone else secretly wishes they could be. Except Cartman is not free. The show has been showing you this for 25 years, if you know where to look. Cartman is not free because freedom requires a self to be free. Freedom requires an interior life that experiences freedom as a positive condition, rather than simply as the absence of constraints. Cartman does not experience freedom as positive. He does not experience it at all. He experiences the absence of constraints, the way a flood experiences the absence of a dam, not as liberation, as opportunity to spread. And the people who admire him, the people who see his behavior and think, I wish I could do that, are admiring the flood. They are admiring the damage. They are looking at the wreckage Cartman leaves behind and concluding that the thing that caused the wreckage must be powerful, and power must be good, because the alternative, that the wreckage is just wreckage, and the thing that caused it is just broken, is too uncomfortable to sit with. Look, I have been making these videos for a while now, and I am always slightly amazed by how much depth you can find in shows that the world has decided are just cartoons. South Park is a show about construction paper kids in a small town in Colorado. It has fart jokes. It has poop jokes. It has an anthropomorphic piece of feces who wears a Christmas hat and sings songs. It is not trying to be a philosophy lecture. It is trying to make you laugh while you fall asleep. And it does that. It is very good at that. But the thing about Trey Parker and Matt Stone is that they cannot help themselves. They are too smart and too angry and too genuinely disturbed by the things they see in the world to make a show that is only funny. They keep finding the nerve. They keep pressing on it. They keep building characters that embody ideas they have never articulated in interviews, but that are visible in every frame of animation if you know how to look. And Cartman is the sharpest nerve they have ever found. He is the thing that hurts when you press on it. The thing that makes the audience uncomfortable in ways they cannot quite name. The thing that is funniest when it is most disturbing, and most disturbing when it is most funny. He is the show's best character, because he is its most honest character. Not honest in the sense of truthful, honest in the sense of undisguised. Every other character in South Park is performing something. Stan is performing normalcy. Kyle is performing righteousness. Kenny is performing resilience. Randy is performing relevance. Butters is performing trust. And they are all choosing how to present themselves to the world, making decisions about what to show and what to hide, constructing identities out of the raw material of their experiences. Cartman is not performing anything. He is not constructing an identity. He is simply expressing appetite. And the appetite is always the same. More. It does not matter what the more consists of. Food, power, attention, control, victory over Kyle, acknowledgement from Butters, the tears of unfathomable sadness. Whatever is available, whatever can be taken, whatever fills the space for the 3 seconds before the space opens up again and demands to be filled again. And the cycle continues. And the cycle never ends, because appetite without satisfaction is the definition of hell. Nietzsche described hell not as a place of punishment, but as the eternal recurrence of the same life, repeated forever, without variation, without escape. The person who cannot say yes to this repetition, who would recoil from the idea of living their life again exactly as they have lived it, is the person who has not achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest form of human existence. They are still running, still avoiding, still hoping that the next scheme, the next meal, the next conquest will be the one that finally makes the running stop. Cartman is running. He has been running since the first episode. He has been running for 25 years. And the show, which moves at the same 6-day sprint as its protagonist, has been running with him, documenting every step, every scheme, every moment where the running almost stops and then does not, because stopping would require something that Cartman does not have and has never had, and the show is not certain, can be given to someone who was never built to receive it. That is Cartman at the chili cook-off. That is Cartman eating the fried chicken skin before anyone else gets home. That is Cartman convincing Butters the world has ended, so he can go to a birthday party at a Mexican restaurant. The scale is absurd. The stakes are tiny. The philosophy is exactly correct. The will to power, disconnected from any value system, any creative purpose, any concern for anything beyond its own momentary satisfaction, does not produce the Ubermensch. It produces a fat kid eating chili and licking tears off someone's face. I've been sitting with something while putting this together that I want to share before we go any further. One of the things I find most impressive about what Trey Parker and Matt Stone have done with this character is that they have never broken the comedy to deliver the philosophy. They have never had a character turn to the camera and say, Eric Cartman represents the failure of post-moral individualism in a culture that has lost its ethical foundations. They do not need to. The show embeds the argument in the behavior. Every episode, every scheme, every manipulation, every moment where Cartman does something terrible and gets away with it, or does not get away with it but does not change regardless, is the argument. The philosophy is the plot. The plot is the philosophy. And the fact that it is wrapped in fart jokes and construction paper, and a 9-year-old screaming about respect for his authority does not diminish the argument. It amplifies it, because the disguise is part of the point. Nietzsche warned that the most dangerous ideas are the ones that arrive in disguise. Not the ones that announce themselves as threats, but the ones that slip into a culture dressed as entertainment, as comedy, as something too trivial to take seriously. Cartman has been on American television since August 13th, 1997. He has been watched by millions of people. He has become one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the world, and the vast majority of people who watch him, who laugh at him, who quote him, who wear his image on t-shirts and put his catchphrases in their social media bios, have never once stopped to ask what it means that the most popular character on one of the most successful shows in the history of American television is a child with no conscience. The culture absorbs Cartman the same way it absorbs everything, as content, as entertainment, as something to consume between meals. And Cartman, the character, would understand this perfectly. He would see the audience consuming him the same way he sees Butters believing that the world has ended, as confirmation that the performance works, as proof that the space where morality used to be is now available for anyone willing to walk into it and set up shop. Let me talk about what happens when the show tries to change him, because the show has tried multiple times, and the failure of each attempt is not a failure of storytelling, it is the point. In Test, as I described earlier, Cesar Millan's dog training techniques actually work. Cartman reforms. He does his homework. He is polite. He is, for a brief moment, what he might have been if any of the adults in his life had ever given him what he actually needed. And then Leanne undoes it, because she needs the broken version of him more than the fixed version. The show is saying that Cartman cannot be fixed in isolation. He exists within a system. Leanne is part of the system. The town is part of the system. The culture of permissiveness and entertainment and looking the other way is part of the system. You cannot fix the product without fixing the factory. In the South Park specials, the post-COVID films that aired in 2021, the show imagined what Cartman might look like as an adult. And the version they showed was, on the surface, the most reformed Cartman imaginable. He had converted to Judaism. He had a wife and children. He was a rabbi. He was kind, patient, devout. He had become, in every visible way, the opposite of what he had been as a child. And Kyle did not believe it. Kyle, who had spent his entire childhood fighting Cartman, who knew what Cartman was capable of better than anyone, looked at this reformed version and saw the performance. He could not stop seeing the performance. He could not stop waiting for the mask to slip. And the show, which normally rewards Kyle's moral instincts, played this ambiguously enough that the audience could not tell either. Was this a genuine change? Had Cartman actually become a good person? Or was this the most elaborate, long-term manipulation Cartman had ever attempted? The show never entirely answers this question, and the refusal to answer is itself the answer. Because the question of whether Cartman can change is the question of whether a person who has never had a genuine moral self can develop one. And the show, after 25 years of examining this character, is not sure. It is genuinely not sure. And that uncertainty is the most honest thing the show has ever said about what it means to be a person in a world without a ceiling. And this brings me back to where we started. The chili cook-off, the smile, the tears. There is a scene in the 5th season of South Park that lasts about 40 seconds, and it changed the entire show forever. But I want you to think about it differently now. I want you to think about it not as a joke, not as a shocking moment of cartoon villainy, not even as a character-defining turning point. And I want you to think about it as a philosophical proposition. A 9-year-old boy in a small town in Colorado has no father, a mother who gives him everything and asks nothing, friends who tolerate him because the alternative is boring, and an intelligence that is entirely directed at getting what he wants at the expense of whoever happens to be standing nearby. He lives in a world where the adults are incompetent, the institutions are broken, the moral authority of the community is a joke that the community itself does not know it is telling. And the only person who consistently tries to hold him accountable, Kyle, is someone he has already learned to use as fuel. He has looked at the world as clearly and as honestly as any 9-year-old can, and he has concluded that it is his. Not because he earned it, not because he deserves it, but because nobody is stopping him. Because the space where stop is supposed to come from, the moral structure, the authority, the ceiling, is empty. And in the emptiness, The only thing that operates is appetite. And appetite, unrestrained by any value system, uninstructed by any moral education, unshaped by any meaningful consequence, will eat everything it can reach and then look around for more. Nietzsche saw this coming. He did not describe Cartman specifically, obviously. He described the conditions that would produce a Cartman. He described the cultural vacuum that a Cartman would fill. He described the failure of every institution that was supposed to prevent a Cartman from becoming what a Cartman becomes. He described the comfortable, mediocre, entertainment-saturated world that would watch a Cartman and laugh and buy the merchandise and never once stop to ask what the laughter was covering. And the laughter was covering the same thing it always covers. The same thing Rick Sanchez's catchphrase covers. The same thing every culture uses comedy to cover. The thing that is too uncomfortable to say directly, so it gets wrapped in a joke and handed to an audience that has already been trained not to hold it too long. I want to stop and talk about how South Park is made, because I think the production process itself is part of the Cartman argument, and if that sounds like a stretch, bear with me. South Park is famously produced on a 6-day cycle. Most animated shows take months to produce a single episode. South Park does it in 6 days. Trey Parker and Matt Stone write, record, animate, and deliver each episode in less than a week. This is documented in the 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, which followed the production of the season 15 premiere from start to finish. The process is chaotic, exhausting, and utterly unique in the history of television animation. And the reason it matters for what we are talking about is that the 6-day cycle means the show is essentially reactive. It responds to events in real time. An episode that airs on Wednesday night was being written the previous Thursday. This means that South Park does not have the luxury of distance. It does not get to sit back and think about an issue for months before forming an opinion. It has to react immediately, instinctively, from the gut. And this is why the show's take on Cartman is so interesting, because Cartman is the one element of the show that is never reactive. Cartman is always the same. The world around him changes. The issues change. The targets of the satire change. But Cartman's fundamental nature, his appetite, his amorality, his willingness to exploit whatever situation he finds himself in, these things are constants. He is the fixed point around which the show's commentary rotates. And the fact that Parker and Stone have maintained this consistency across more than 300 episodes and 25 years, writing in 6-day sprints under enormous pressure, without ever softening Cartman or redeeming him or explaining him away, tells you something about how deeply they understand what this character represents. Parker has said in interviews that he and Stone feel they most identify with Cartman of all the characters. That is a revealing and somewhat disturbing admission from the creators of the show. They are not saying they share his cruelty or his amorality. They are saying that the voice, the perspective, the way of looking at the world that Cartman embodies is the one that comes most naturally to them. The satirist's eye, the eye that sees through the performance to the mechanism underneath, the eye that notices that the emperor has no clothes and finds the nudity hilarious rather than tragic. That is Cartman's eye. He looks at the world and sees performances, and the fact that his response to seeing performances is to exploit them rather than to call them out is what separates him from the satirist. But the vision is the same. The clarity is the same. The willingness to name what is actually happening is the same. This is why Cartman is so much more dangerous than a simple villain. A villain is someone who opposes the good. Cartman is someone who has seen through the good and found it empty, and he is not wrong about the emptiness. He is wrong about what to do with the information. But the information itself, the observation that much of what passes for morality in the world of South Park is performance, habit, social pressure, and mutual delusion, that observation is one that the show itself shares. The show sees the same emptiness Cartman sees. It just responds differently. The show responds with satire, with the hope that naming the emptiness will create space for something genuine to replace it. Cartman responds with appetite, and the distance between satire and appetite, between the hope that naming a problem will help solve it and the certainty that a problem is just another opportunity. That distance is the show's entire moral argument. It is the difference between Parker and Stone and the character they created. I keep thinking about something Matt Stone said in an interview once. I cannot remember the exact phrasing, so I will paraphrase. He said that when they write Cartman, they start with the most selfish possible interpretation of any situation and work backward from there. What would a person do if they had no conscience and unlimited confidence? What would someone say if they genuinely believed they were the most important person in the room? What would a child become if no one ever successfully told them no? And they start with the worst and see if it is funny. And it is almost always funny. That is the problem. Because the funniness is seductive. It is seductive in the same way that Cartman's schemes are seductive. You watch him manipulate Butters, or outwit Kyle, or terrorize the town, and part of you, a part you might not want to acknowledge, finds it entertaining. Not because you agree with what he is doing, because the energy of it is compelling, the absolute certainty, the total absence of self-doubt, the willingness to say and do things that normal social constraints would prevent any reasonable person from saying or doing. There is a vicarious thrill in watching someone operate without friction, and that thrill is not something the show accidentally produces. It is something the show produces deliberately, and then turns into the subject of its own examination. The show is studying the audience's response to Cartman the same way it studies everything else. It is watching you watch Cartman and asking what your enjoyment of him says about you. Not accusingly, not with moralistic finger-wagging. South Park does not finger-wag. It just shows you what you are laughing at and lets you decide what to do with that information. And most of the time, most people do the same thing they do with every uncomfortable truth that arrives disguised as entertainment. They laugh and move on, and do not think about it until the next episode. This is the herd response. This is the last man's response. This is the blink, and Cartman would love it. He would see the audience consuming him, and he would recognize it immediately. And another group of people who do not know they are being used. Another congregation that showed up to the church without realizing the preacher does not believe in God. Another set of marks in a world full of them, paying for the privilege of watching their own warning being performed for their entertainment. Trey Parker once said that South Park is the one show that makes fun of everyone equally. He has said this in multiple interviews, and it has become a kind of mission statement for the show. Left, right, religious, secular, famous, obscure, nobody is safe. And this commitment to equal opportunity satire is one of the things that makes South Park so effective. The audience can never predict who will be next. They can never settle into a comfortable position where they know the show agrees with them. South Park keeps you off balance. It keeps you honest. It keeps you aware that the moment you start nodding along is the moment the joke might turn on you. And Cartman is the character who most fully embodies this commitment to uncomfortable honesty. Because Cartman does not care who he offends, or who he exploits, or who he hurts. Not because he is making a philosophical point about the arbitrariness of social conventions. Because he is hungry, and you are standing between him and the buffet. The equal opportunity offender is not a position Cartman has chosen. It is a consequence of his nature. He does not discriminate in his cruelty because discrimination would require him to see other people as distinct individuals rather than as undifferentiated obstacles. And seeing people as individuals would require a capacity for empathy that he does not possess. But here is where I think the show does its most important work. Here is where the construction paper and the fart jokes and the 25 years of building this character piece by piece, episode by episode, line by line, all converge into something that I think deserves to be taken seriously. The show never makes Cartman the hero. Not once. Not for a single episode. Even in episodes where Cartman is technically on the right side of an argument. Even in episodes where his schemes accidentally produce positive outcomes. Even in the rare moments where he seems to show genuine human feeling, the show never endorses him. It never says, "See, he's not so bad." It never gives the audience permission to admire him without reservation. It shows you the full picture. The intelligence and the emptiness. The capability and the cruelty, and the performance and the vacancy underneath it, and it trusts you to hold all of it at once. That trust is the show's greatest achievement, greater than any individual episode, greater than any individual joke. The trust that the audience can look at a character who is both funny and terrible, both compelling and empty, both extraordinary and completely without value, and not need the show to tell them which of those things matters most. Because in a world without a ceiling, nobody is going to tell you. You have to decide for yourself. And that, more than anything else, is what Nietzsche was trying to say. The thing the laughter is covering, the thing Nietzsche warned about, the thing Cartman embodies more completely than any character in the history of American television, is this. In the absence of genuine moral structure, and the person who cares least wins. Not the strongest, not the smartest, not the most virtuous, the person who cares least. Because caring is friction. Caring is the thing that slows you down, that makes you consider consequences, that forces you to weigh your desires against someone else's well-being. And in a world without a ceiling, without an authority, without a structure that makes caring obligatory rather than optional, the person who does not care moves fastest. They arrive first. They eat the skin off the chicken before anyone else gets home. They take the space. They fill the vacuum. And then they look at everyone else. Everyone who cared enough to hesitate. Everyone who paused to consider whether what they were doing was right. And they lick the tears off their faces and say, yummy. That is what Nietzsche warned us about. Not Cartman specifically, but every Cartman. Every version of this figure that has ever appeared in any culture at any time. The person who inherits the freedom that comes with the collapse of moral authority and uses it for the smallest, meanest, most self-serving purposes imaginable. Not the Ubermensch. Not the last man. Something worse. The child who was never taught, never shaped, never given a reason to believe that anyone else's experience of the world is as real as his own. The child who fills the empty space with his own appetite and calls it the universe. South Park has been telling you this since season 1, since Cartman first sat at that bus stop with Stan and Kyle and Kenny and said something horrible and nobody stopped him. Since the first time he manipulated Butters. Since the first time he used Kyle's morality as a weapon against him. Since the moment Trey Parker opened his mouth and spoke in that voice, that high-pitched, petulant, endlessly demanding voice, and gave the world a character that the world would laugh at and love and put on t-shirts without ever once stopping to hear what was being said. There is a moment I keep thinking about. It is not from a specific episode. It is from the opening credits. Every single episode of South Park begins with the 4 boys standing at a bus stop. The bus arrives, they get on, and they go to school. It happens in the credits of every episode. It is the most ordinary thing imaginable. 4 kids waiting for a bus, going to school, starting a day. And Cartman is always there, standing with the other 3, or wearing his red jacket and his blue hat with the yellow pom-pom, looking like any other kid, indistinguishable from the group unless you know what you're looking at. That image, that daily repetition of normalcy, is the show's deepest statement about what Cartman represents. He looks normal. He stands where normal kids stand. He goes where normal kids go. He is embedded in the infrastructure of daily life in a way that makes his extraordinarily dangerous nature invisible. He is not a monster in a dungeon. He is not a supervillain in a fortress. He is a kid at a bus stop. And the people around him, the people who have known him for years, who have seen what he is capable of, who have watched him do things that should disqualify him from normal life permanently, keep standing next to him every morning, keep getting on the bus with him, keep going to school with him, keep treating his presence as something that is simply part of the landscape, a fixed feature of their world that they have learned to navigate around rather than remove. That is the warning. Not that Cartman exists. Not that people like Cartman will always exist. The warning is that we will stand at the bus stop with them every morning and not notice. We will absorb them into the fabric of daily life. We will adjust our expectations downward, degree by degree, until what would have been intolerable becomes merely annoying, and what was merely annoying becomes normal, and what was normal becomes invisible. We will do this because the alternative, confronting what is standing next to us, really confronting it, with the full weight of what it means and what it costs and what it says about the world we have built, is more work than most people are willing to do before the bus arrives. Nietzsche knew this. He knew that the most dangerous thing in the world is not the monster. It is the culture that has learned to live with the monster. The culture that has adjusted. The culture that has normalized. The culture that has turned the monster into content, into entertainment, into a funny kid at a bus stop who says terrible things and makes us laugh and gets on the bus and goes to school and comes home and does it again tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, forever. I am not saying South Park is a philosophy lecture. It is not. It is a comedy show made with digital animation designed to look like construction paper. Created by 2 guys from Colorado who have said repeatedly that they do not have a coherent political ideology and that they mostly just want to make each other laugh. But the thing about Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the thing that has kept this show relevant for more than a quarter century, is that their instincts are philosophical, even when their intentions are comedic. They keep finding the pressure points. They keep building characters that embody ideas they have never articulated explicitly. They keep making a show about a small town in Colorado that somehow manages to say more about the human condition than most prestige dramas manage in their entire run. And Cartman is the sharpest thing they ever made. Sharper than Randy's midlife crisis. Sharper than Kenny's recurring death. Sharper than Stan's growing disillusionment. Is sharper than any single episode or special or movie. Because Cartman is not a character who has a relationship with a philosophical question. Cartman is the philosophical question, walking around in a red jacket and a blue hat, screaming at people and eating cheesy poofs and making the world smaller with every breath he takes. Nietzsche spent the last productive years of his life in a state of increasing urgency, writing faster, publishing more, pushing his ideas to their limits. He knew he was running out of time. He could feel the collapse coming, not of the old moral order. That collapse was already underway, but of himself. In January 1889, in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche saw a horse being beaten by its owner. He threw his arms around the horse's neck and collapsed. He never recovered. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental deterioration, cared for by his mother and then his sister, unable to write, unable to think, unable to finish the work he had started. The warning was left unfinished. The description of what was coming was left incomplete. Nietzsche pointed at the horizon and said, "Something is out there. I can see its shape. I can describe some of what it will look like, but I will not be here when it arrives." It arrived. It is 9 years old. It lives in a small town in Colorado. It does not know anything about Friedrich Nietzsche. It does not need to. It is the answer to the question Nietzsche asked, delivered in construction paper, wrapped in comedy, and handed to a culture that was too busy laughing to hear what was being said. The thing nobody talks about. The thing I keep coming back to is that the show has never once apologized for Cartman. It has never softened him. It has never explained him away. It has never given the audience the comfort of a redemption arc that sticks. It has shown you what this kind of person looks like, and what this kind of person does to the people around them, and it has trusted you to draw your own conclusions. I think that trust is the most Nietzschean thing the show has ever done, because Nietzsche did not offer solutions. He did not tell people what to build in the space where God used to be. He just pointed at the space and said, "Something will go there. You should care about what it is." And then he hugged a horse and disappeared. South Park points at the same space, and it fills it with a 9-year-old boy who has no conscience and no limit and no reason to stop. And it says, "Look, this is what went there. This is what you let go there while you were watching television and eating snacks and assuming someone else would take care of it." And we blinked, and we discovered happiness, and we bought the t-shirt. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.